Beneath the pristine gates of the Dupree estate, where wealth and appearances promised safety and control, a storm has been silently gathering. Secrets that were buried for years are clawing their way to the surface, shattering trust, love, and loyalty in their wake. Betrayal waits in every shadow, and even the closest bonds are revealed to be fragile illusions. Tomas once believed Kat was his anchor, Eva his enemy, but the truth is far more twisted, far more devastating than anyone could imagine. What unfolds is a harrowing descent into rage, manipulation, and revenge, where every choice could ignite destruction, and every revelation leaves the powerful and the innocent alike teetering on the edge of ruin. The air inside the great hall thickened like tar the moment the truth was unleashed. Hundreds of camera flashes detonated in the room, slicing the space with sharp bursts of white light that felt like scalpels against raw nerves. In the center of it all stood Tomas, rigid as stone, his jaw locked and shoulders coiled with a rage so suffocating that it felt as though oxygen itself had abandoned him. For years he had carried the weight of that fire, the whispers, the suspicion, the accusations carved into every glance that brushed against him. But he had always held on to one fragile belief: Kat had been his anchor, the one person who stood on his side of the burning line. That illusion now lay in ruin. The recording had been merciless. Cold. Mechanical. A single string of evidence that sliced through years of lies like a blade through silk. Tomas wasn't just betrayed. He had been trapped, framed, abandoned in a void built carefully by someone he once loved more than his own sanity. The betrayal didn't bleed out slowly, it struck like a hammer to the skull. And Eva, she was never innocent. She had held this evidence for months, perhaps longer, waiting like a patient spider, feeding on the silence. She had let Kat believe she was safe, let Tomas rot beneath the weight of collective hatred, and when the negotiations failed, she dragged them both into the pit she had so meticulously prepared. She had been waiting for this moment. Their destruction was not an accident, but an orchestration. Kat trembled under the glare of lights. The faces around her, once filled with calculated admiration, now gleamed with the sick curiosity of vultures circling a dying animal. She felt naked under the weight of their eyes, stripped of every layer of carefully curated control. The sound of the recording still echoed in the hall like a metallic heartbeat, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of her carefully constructed kingdom. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't fight it. Her empire of deception was crumbling in full view of everyone who mattered. Tomas's fury was not a fire, it was an avalanche. Slow at first, then unstoppable. His hands clenched without him realizing it. The betrayal ran deeper than the wound of a lie, it invaded the marrow of his identity. He remembered the night of the fire, the rain, the smoke, the chaos, Kat's trembling hands as she swore they'd survive this together. All of it had been poison wrapped in the warm disguise of love. She hadn't saved him. She had used him. Every insult hurled at him, every door that had slammed in his face since that night, had been the consequence of her choice. And now, the weight of that truth was cracking something inside him that might never be repaired. Eva watched with the stillness of a predator who had already bitten into flesh. There was no triumph in her face, no joy. Only the calm of a woman who had already accepted damnation long before this night. She knew what she had done. She had detonated the bomb that could not be undetonated. Kat would fall, Tomas would shatter, and she, cold, meticulous Eva, would be the one who dragged them both into the flames. But even Eva had underestimated what rage can become when it stops being human. Tomas's anger was no longer grief. It was evolution. The boy who was framed was gone. What stood in his place now was a storm, and storms don't negotiate. Outside the hall, the community was already alive with whispers. The closed gates that were meant to keep danger out were now trapping chaos inside. Phones recorded, news alerts pinged, and somewhere in the crowd, someone was already preparing to weaponize this scandal for their own gain. No one cared about justice. They cared about blood. Kat tried to hold herself together, but panic crawled beneath her skin like insects. For years she had been certain she was the smartest person in the room, the one who could twist narratives and silence the past. She had underestimated Eva. She had underestimated Tomas. She had underestimated how truth, once exposed, spreads like a disease. The past doesn't die. It waits, patient and vengeful, until the perfect moment to return. Her mind burned with the memory of that night, the acrid smoke, the distant sirens, the sound of crackling wood and shattering glass. She remembered standing there, making the choice that would ruin a life that wasn't hers. Tomas had been the perfect scapegoat, disposable, powerless, desperate. She had believed she'd buried it so deep that no one would ever dig it up again. But here it was, resurrected in front of the entire council and community. Her carefully controlled world was turning into quicksand. Eva, in her icy calm, felt a shiver crawl down her spine. In Kat's hollow stare she saw something she hadn't calculated for. A cornered creature has nothing left to lose, and when stripped of its illusions, it bites. She suddenly realized that this game might not end with Kat on the floor, it might end with all of them buried beneath it. Tomas's departure from the hall was silent, but his absence was louder than any scream. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The hall behind him erupted into chaos, council members muttering strategies, neighbors gossiping, the air thick with fear disguised as outrage. But Tomas heard none of it. His pulse was a war drum. The betrayal didn't make him weak. It made him something dangerous. Back inside, Kat stared at the stage she once ruled. The podium where she had made decisions, manipulated narratives, dictated who rose and who fell, now stood like a monument to her own ruin. Those who had once bowed to her influence avoided her eyes like she was a contagion. Power doesn't disappear with a scream, it rots in silence, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. Eva walked out with the posture of someone who had won. But victory felt hollow. She had played her hand, and there was no undoing it. She could not control Tomas's rage. She could not predict how far Kat would go when cornered. She had set the dominoes in motion, and now the structure would collapse in ways no one could foresee. Tomas wandered into the night, the rain soaking through his shirt, every drop amplifying the noise inside his skull. He wasn't just angry at Kat. He was angry at himself, for trusting her, for surviving that fire, for letting the world shape him into a scapegoat. His rage became directionless, seeking something, anything, to destroy. Eva returned to her home knowing the walls could no longer contain what she had unleashed. She thought she was playing chess. She realized she had thrown a lit match into a room full of gasoline. Kat locked herself in her office and stared at the painting hanging over the fireplace, the one she had hung years ago to cover the burn marks from that night. It was always there. She had always known. She had never truly escaped the fire. She had merely hidden it behind expensive frames and carefully crafted lies. The news spread through the gated community like a contagion. Names were whispered. Allegiances shifted. Those who had once been allies began crafting escape plans, quietly positioning themselves away from the blast zone. Power is never loyal, it bends toward survival. And right now, survival meant abandoning Kat. But Kat's mind was no longer steady. A kind of desperation was blooming inside her, a hunger to take everything down with her if she was going to fall. She could already see how Tomas's rage would consume him. She could already see how Eva would face the backlash of her own betrayal. She could turn this disaster into a war zone. Eva lay awake that night, the silence of her house pressing against her ears like water. For the first time, she felt a flicker of unease. She had always believed that exposing the truth would give her power. But what she had done wasn't exposure, it was ignition. Every choice she had made had cut off her exits one by one, until she, too, stood on the edge of the same cliff as Kat and Tomas. Tomas stared at his reflection in a rain-streaked window, and what stared back was not the man who had been framed, not the man who loved Kat, not the man who believed in justice. What stared back was something fractured and dangerous, something forged in betrayal. There was no going back. Love had rotted into fury, trust into poison, and all that remained was the promise of destruction. The following morning, the community awoke to a storm not of rain, but of consequences. Reports flooded the networks. Some defended Tomas as the true victim, others turned on Kat like wolves smelling blood. And then there were those who circled Eva, not with praise but suspicion. No one trusts the hand that holds the knife. Kat arrived at the council chamber long before the others, her hair disheveled, the weight of a sleepless night pulling her shoulders down. She wasn't the queen anymore. She was a condemned woman standing inside the ruins of her own throne room. But beneath the exhaustion was something else. Something sharper. A resolve that reeked of danger. Eva entered minutes later, calm on the outside, hollow on the inside. The once unbreakable mask was still there, but cracks spidered beneath the surface. She could feel Tomas in the air, not present, but looming, like a storm brewing over the horizon. His silence was louder than either of their screams. The board was set. 3 lives now entangled not by love, not by loyalty, but by mutual ruin. Tomas was the wounded beast with nothing left to lose. Kat was the fallen queen, sharp and desperate. Eva was the schemer who thought she controlled the fire, until she realized she was standing in the middle of it. Their secrets had not simply surfaced. They had detonated. And in the aftermath of truth, there are no survivors, only the living, waiting their turn to burn. And somewhere, beneath the fractured surface of their carefully constructed lives, something new began to stir, not redemption, not forgiveness, but the first slow, poisonous bloom of war. As the hall emptied and the flashes dimmed, the echoes of betrayal lingered like smoke, suffocating every thought. Tomas walked away, each step heavy with rage and heartbreak, knowing that trust had become a weapon turned against him. Kat remained, trembling yet defiant, aware that her empire of lies had crumbled, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Eva, once the orchestrator, felt a flicker of unease. Control had slipped through her fingers, and the chaos she unleashed could consume her as easily as it did the others. Outside, the world whispered of scandal and ruin, but inside, the 3 were trapped in a private inferno of anger, regret, and shattered loyalty. Nothing would ever be the same again. Every glance, every decision from now on carried the weight of their exposed secrets, and the fragile veneer of civility had shattered forever.